My name is Justice Ortep. I am the product manager for Tazama. I've been working on this project now for about 5 years. Our journey originally started very much as part of Mojaloop. So I'm sure there are very many people in the audience already who are aware of us and have worked alongside us as we were building this product. And we're very happy to be here again at a Mojaloop convening to be able to share our progress and our product with you. But first, I think we want to be able to just set the scene for everybody who might be unfamiliar with Tazama and the scourge of fraud in our ecosystems. But I think there's not many people here who actually have no experience of fraud. We either have had this experience ourselves personally, or we know people directly who have been defrauded or scammed in some way, often through no fault of their own. We are trusting human beings and we believe the best in everybody else. So it happens that people would exploit our vulnerabilities, our insecurities, our fears, and our desperation sometimes to take money from us. And in our environment, the people who can least afford to lose the money are indeed the people that we are focusing on to be able to include them into digital economies. And if we don't address the problem of fraud, then those people are discouraged from joining, and then they still remain financially excluded. So from that perspective, fraud is an important problem for us to address. And in any ecosystem, the boundaries, fraud knows no boundaries, and fraud is pervasive, and it affects everyone. What we often see in a lot of ecosystems is the fraudsters move between countries, they move between banks, they are operating from other countries into specific countries. So your country is not safe. You can fight all the fraud you want in your own territory, but your users and your ecosystem is always going to be at risk from people from outside your ecosystem as well. These people are extremely well organized. They run call centers, they run fraud as a business, and they are geared towards making a profit, and they are often making a profit at our expense. What we also see very often is that inside a particular institution, the fraudsters kind of move around like a swarm of locusts. They will harvest as much income as they can from a specific provider until that provider realizes that they have a problem out of the ordinary, and then the swarm will move on to another provider as new controls are put in place to prevent the attacks and the methods that the fraudsters have been using to steal money from the bank's customers. And all of the banks operate as individual silos then in that environment. So a bank will prevent fraud and do a little bit more to protect their own customers, and then the fraudsters will move on to a different bank, but those banks don't talk to each other to share the information, the knowledge about the fraud, the knowledge about the typologies, and there's no single central coordinated effort typically to deal with fraud. At this point, I think in everybody's financial crime ecosystems and journeys, the problem of money laundering, for example, and countering the financing of terrorism is relatively solved. We think organizations like FATF, for example, have done a lot of work in compelling the world at large to take money laundering seriously as a problem. We don't yet see the same kind of attention to fraud from a regulatory perspective. So at the moment, there are some areas in the world where fraud is becoming a little bit more prevalent and regulators are starting to focus on it. And it's often an extension of their consumer protection efforts. So banks are being compelled to protect their customers from fraud. And if they don't, those banks will be held liable for the losses that are suffered by their customers as well. And that kind of initiative typically has to come with a regulatory sort of a drive. Regulators have to assist and they have to compel these markets to attend to the problem. And as we all know, fraud is a widespread issue, and it is also a growing issue. And we've got a slide here with a whole lot of scary statistics on it. I'm not going to read through all of these in particular. Also just want to call out that the Global Anti-Scam Alliance estimated in 2024 that over $1 trillion is lost to scams in particular as a part of fraud. And we also see reported by a large number of territories that something like authorized push payments fraud continues to be a problem and is on the rise. And direct intervention and efforts are required by regulators and the ecosystems themselves to prevent authorized push payments fraud. And for those not familiar with what that means, is that is typically where somebody has been convinced to hand over their money to a scammer at their own sort of volition. Right? They have been convinced to make a payment, and these are typically romance scams. It could be something like an advanced fee fraud, for example, where you are ordering something off Facebook and you're asked to send money to somebody else. And then when they send you your parcel, it is in fact a brick wrapped in a box. So those types of frauds are called advanced or authorized push payments fraud, because you as the victim have in fact authorized the payment yourself. And what often happens is the banks look at that kind of behavior and they say, well, but you should have known better. And ultimately, it's your own fault. And that's where we expect that regulators will start stepping in a little bit more often to tell people, and banks in particular, that they should attend to that problem a little bit more succinctly, and then enforce that through that sense of shared liability. So if the bank allows you to be defrauded on their network, the bank has to share in the loss. Tazama itself, so addressing these kind of problems demands technology. It demands education of your own users and consumers. You need to be able to constantly make people aware of the latest trends in scams and fraudulent behavior, how these things work so that they can be educated to protect themselves as often as they can. And also shared intelligence. It does not help an entire ecosystem if the swarm of locusts can just move from one bank to another with impunity. It helps a little bit more if the banks can share knowledge about the behaviors and the trends that they are seeing, and even the individual accounts that may be involved in defrauding the particular customers, to identify high-risk territories where some of these frauds are originating from. That would also be helpful so that every bank or every institution doesn't have to fight this fight all by themselves. Tazama as a product was created to empower institutions such as yourselves, switching institutions, clearinghouses, central banks, individual banks, mobile money operators, with a free and open source tool to detect and prevent fraud. So that is an open source tool that anybody can have access to and download and implement. And you can use that to scan every transaction in real time so that you can prevent the transactions that include the fraud from settling without impacting your internal customer experience as well. It is immediate, it is quick, and it allows you to take immediate action if you detect any suspicious behavior in your transaction network. There is an urgent case, we think, for a collective response. Fraud tactics are evolving and changing all the time. So as I mentioned, as soon as you build controls in one place, the fraudsters just move on to the next available target, and then they test the boundaries, they test the defenses, and then they will ply their trade in that environment for as long as they can before they have to move on to the next. Emerging trends that we see, we are all familiar with how prevalent AI is now in changing the world. It is also changing the world in some instances, not for the better, but to the advantages of fraudsters. We see people being impersonated very effectively through AI and machine learning methods, facial recognition, completely modeling somebody's voice. I'm sure everybody had seen the article, I think from last year, where the bank in Hong Kong was defrauded to the tune of several $1 million. And that was after the poor clerk who was in charge of making that payment was actually invited to a Zoom call where all of the people that were supposed to give him authority to make that payment were impersonated through AI. And he thought that he was doing the right thing in front of all of these other people. So it is a very dangerous thing, in particular in this environment, and you need different tools to be able to defend against that as well. And you also need better awareness across your ecosystem to be able to identify these. You get biometric fraud and impersonation, digital ID manipulation. All of these things are now things that we also need to be aware of. What we require, tools to flag suspicious transactions, IDs, and accounts in your network. And then we also need some sort of shared platform where this information can be consolidated and where we can track and communicate fraud trends, where we can link patterns between a variety of different institutions, and we can also balance the fraud detection with data protection in particular. We often see that the regulations for data protection, I think maybe in sort of the general cascade of the order of popularity and priority, the world tended to money laundering and the countering the financing of terrorism as a very high priority for a very long time. And then the next thing that everybody seemed to be very concerned about was data protection and making sure that everybody's information was private and protected. And that came in a little bit ahead of the ability to be able to share fraud information for intelligence purposes in particular environments. So there's almost a greater focus on your privacy than there is on the ability to protect you from certain fraud. Fraud requires access to data. Fraud requires access to shared intelligence to be able to be prevented effectively. And in some territories and jurisdictions, we see that people have implemented some controls for data privacy, but then those controls conflict with the requirements to be able to see data to handle fraud. There are often exclusions provided for the money laundering piece because the money laundering piece probably already existed as compliance and regulations in those environments before the data protection really took hold. But because fraud prevention is sometimes a little bit late to the party, it is in some instances overshadowed by the data protection regulations that might already exist. So there has to be some sort of balance between the fraud detection and the data protection approaches. And I think when you are creating a switching operation and you are devising your scheme rules for how the transactions and the participants are expected to behave in that scheme, there should also be some consideration for how you are going to deal with the sharing of data and information to be able to protect the users in that network from fraud. Prevention will always be better than just the detection and the mitigation. What you really want to be able to do is to prevent the transaction from settling and concluding if there is any suspicion that that transaction might include fraud in its behaviors. As an example here, in 2023, Brazil commissioned resolution number 6, what they call, which enabled real-time fraud detection and tracking. So that as an essential first step gave that ecosystem the ability to understand the fraud problem in their ecosystem, get some better transparency over the extent of the problem, and then from that reporting and the sharing of the data inside that network, they were able to instill a faster response. You had fewer repeat attacks because there was better sharing of information amongst all of the institutions. And then that itself also resulted in increased public trust, which is ultimately our goal here also for financial inclusion. With more trust in the ecosystems that are supposed to serve people, more people will be attracted to those ecosystems and the more people will be able to participate in the growing digital economy. In Africa, we don't really have to wait for regulation to lead this charge. This is something that can be done already. And immediately you can start your journey with real-time fraud detection. And that is something that Tazama will at least be able to do. So for an organization, step one will always be to provide that system where you can detect the fraud, get the reporting and the transparency. And that foundational component is essential for being able to then share that data later and collaborate with your ecosystem to make sure that it is safe end to end. We'd mentioned this already, but it's worth mentioning again. Tazama is a free and open source fraud detection and transaction monitoring platform. And the last little bit here is extremely important for us as well here. It was initially built specifically for Mojaloop. We already have the data connectivity that allows you to ingest Mojaloop transactions so that you can evaluate the transactions in a Mojaloop ecosystem. We are able to handle the context of messages going through a Mojaloop switch for both the quoting and the transfer processes. So always Tazama has been built with Mojaloop in mind. And if you have a Mojaloop switch, Tazama is a very good choice as an component to help you detect and fight fraud in that ecosystem. We help banks and other financial services organizations to detect their suspicious behavior in real time. Real time, extremely important to be able to stop the transaction from concluding so that you can prevent the loss in the first place. We have out of the box 33 rules and equal number of typologies that we had created specifically to monitor transactions in instant payment systems, again, with a primary focus on Mojaloop implementations. And that will ensure safe transactions between the payer and the payee across a Mojaloop switch instance. It is accessible to everyone. Free open source means that you do not need a license to be able to operate it and thereby protect your institution and your users. It is available on GitHub now, and you can download it freely and deploy it on your own. But we also have a network of system integrators, many of whom are already in this room, who are familiar with Tazama and have been running POCs and implementations with the software that you can also talk to about their shared experiences and leverage their skills and experience to implement the software. So how do we move ahead without waiting for regulation to catch up? Well, step one is the first thing that you can do is to use something like Tazama to monitor transactions and flag suspicious behavior. Because once you have that in place, what you can then do is you can start sharing your verified fraud data with your legal frameworks and your legal partners, and you can start taking some decisive action against the fraudsters that operate to defraud the customers in your networks. You can create shared lists of suspicious accounts and patterns. Those lists could typically also be enacted inside a switching operation to make sure that those shared lists can be used to block transactions to accounts that operate on that network at a central location. And then you could partner with regional identity verification providers to close that loop to make sure that you have properly identified all of the actors in your network, all of the mule accounts, all of the fake profiles, and then use that as a mechanism to further ensure the safety of your users. And beyond that, you can set up the secure and governance and escalation protocols to make sure that the information that you are sourcing out of the system eventually makes its way to the right place. We do want to show you a little bit about Tazama itself. It has been a while since we were last at a Mojaloop convening where we could illustrate to you how the product works and what it looks like at the moment. So right off the bat, this is going to be new. So we have created a demonstration user interface. We did find that in the past, if we tried to demonstrate Tazama through our as just an engine with an API sitting in front of it, it was a little bit difficult for people to properly understand the results and the behaviors in the system. So we created a user interface front end that is available to organizations or to system integrators to assist in showcasing the system's capabilities. So I'm going to create a very simple scenario here just to be able to illustrate how the system would work. So let's create a mule account as a scammer's account, and then we'll create 2 victims over here. And then this mule account is going to receive transactions. I'm going to put it over on this side. Let's make a payment, right? So this person is going to make a payment, and I would like to make a payment where this account is being systematically drained of funds. So let's make that an easy number for me. And I'm going to send that through the network here. So what the system then does, well, that's exciting. It has blocked that transaction because I have a block apparently against this account here. Always the risk when you're doing a demo. Okay. So in theory, the system should not know who all the people in the network are because we are setting up these accounts from scratch. Let's do this again. Yeah, that's better, right? So we've sent through a transaction across the network, and we've sent a transaction from the victim's account into a scammer's account, and you can immediately see that some of the rules that we have developed have picked up some suspicious behavior, but not sufficient evidence to take any action. So Tazama works on the accumulation of evidence to be able to decide whether a transaction is suspicious enough to enforce, for example, a block against that transaction. But at the moment, all we have identified here is that this is the first time that this particular person has made a payment to this person over here. So no suspicious behavior that resulted in any action that we can take. But if we, for example, say, let's do another transaction, and we are now going to systematically drain, this person is being repeatedly scammed. And now we have a duplicate payment, and now the system will say that payment looks like a duplicate payment to an unfamiliar creditor, so we are going to then block that transaction. But that doesn't prevent the scammer from simply moving on to somebody else and then scamming them as well. So they can move on to a different person or a different bank, different institution, and then they can continue to apply their trade here. Here we go. And this can keep on happening. So there's no shared intelligence. There's nothing here that will help the network or the ecosystem to identify that this person is in fact a scammer. But let's say, for example, that this customer at the first bank, when they were scammed and they made their report, that bank could actually have taken some kind of action. So what we have added to Tazama now is centralized list management functionality. So I can create a block against that particular account. I can block all the messages that are going to be trafficked to and from that account. I'm going to start doing that immediately, and I'm going to do that indefinitely, and I'm going to create a reason here, and I'm going to say that we have fraudulent activity. And we can then save that message. There's our block, which is now affected on the system. So now, if we try and make a payment to that scammer's account, let's create somebody brand new. This transaction will always be blocked. And you will see it here. We have what we call the event flow rule processor, which we have added to the system now. So this will interrogate all of the blocking conditions that may have been created against a particular account. And you can then, that blocking instruction will force that account to be blocked. But in addition to that, even though I have decided to block this particular transaction, the system still generates the outcome that it would have generated if the transaction was allowed to proceed. So we still want to know how the system would have treated that transaction so that we can now say, well, the system did not pick up that this transaction should have been blocked. We caught it because we instituted that physical block on the system in the first place. Now we can also look at where there might be a gap in our detection methodology so that we can perhaps create better rules to close that gap in the future so that we don't necessarily have to catch somebody first before we can institute a block in the system to stop them from transacting. So this is the new and additional functionality that we have added to Tazama recently. You're able to fully control transaction flow within the system, and you can do that at a central location based on the shared intelligence between you and your network partners. And then just coming back to the presentation, we also just quickly want to look ahead at some of the changes that are coming up for Tazama in the future. So some of you who have been walking along this journey with us over the last 5 years or so, this little block over here is everything that we have been working on. So initially, Tazama was proposed as a detection engine, and it would plug into a modular loop switching transaction ecosystem, and it would quietly sit there and monitor all of the transactions and then flag any suspicious transactions for somebody to look at. Over our engagement with customers within the modular loop community itself and beyond, we realized that what people are actually looking for is a slightly more comprehensive approach to fraud management at large. We don't just want to offer a detection service, but people also want to be able to access the related services for fraud management. And that includes a case management solution, that includes the data warehousing and the analytics and the business intelligence that goes around that. Beyond that, also, you will have the capability to do regulatory reporting, which I suppose is coming for everyone in the end. So all of these additional functionalities are being developed at the moment. The The functionality will then be part of the upcoming Camisa implementation. So as you all know, Camisa will be implementing a Moduloop switch for their DRPP, the digital retails platform, in quarter 3 of this year. So Tazama will be providing the fraud transaction monitoring and detection services for Camisa, along with all of these original components that were required by Camisa to ensure the effective operation and safety of their platform. So these are all components that are also coming up now and will be part of Tazama's open source offering. We know that the Moduloop community is also currently exploring dispute management. So hopefully the Tazama case management system here will also be able to meet the requirements of the dispute management processes and workflow in a single central location, so that if you are using Tazama to help with the fraud monitoring and the fraud detection, and you have the case management system attached, then that case management system can be extended to also help with the dispute resolution, so that you can do all of those functionalities in a single place. So just to wrap up, the power of free and open collaboration, which is what we at Tazama aim to achieve. Tazama helps financial institutions and switches, in particular Moduloop, monitor real-time transactions, analyze the fraud patterns in your environments and your ecosystems, and then gives you that first step in a fraud defense between the senders and receivers without any vendor lock-in, that lays the foundation then for you to be able to share that knowledge and information within your ecosystems with your partners, and then help to protect more than just a single institution at the time, but everybody in your ecosystem. And in that way, we can build a shared infrastructure for fraud detection in Africa for Africa. Thank you very much for your time. I don't know if there are any questions, and Samin, if I have time for questions, but I'd be happy to take some.
You do have time for questions. I think there are a few in the chat. Let's start with Matt. Are you able to share anything about those running Tazama already?
I can share that we have Tazama running in a number of different sites. We have 2 installations or implementations in Mongolia at the moment for a mobile number operator there. And we also have a Tazama instance running in Nigeria. We also have a Tazama instance, I think, very close to deployment. They are towards the end of their POC, running for a major payments aggregator in the United States, which is also really exciting for us. Our target market and our focus area, as you all know, is financial inclusion across Africa and Southeast Asia. But we are delighted that the system is also adopted by organizations and companies in more established markets. Hopefully that is a trend that we will see continue in the future. And then we have a number of POCs that are currently in progress or have just concluded. We've just finished a POC. Cybran was running for IPSL in Kenya as well. So that had some very promising results, and we are looking forward to assisting IPSL in the future as well. They are currently considering their options, and hopefully Tazama would be one of them. Thank you very much, Matt, for that.
Jerome just has a follow-up. What version of Tazama did you show in the demo?
The version of Tazama in the demo is our release candidate for Tazama version 2.2. Tazama 2.2 is currently being wrapped up by the development team. We've just gone through our round of housekeeping. So all of our Dependabot PRs have been cleared. I just got the approvals today. So we're busy packaging that release, and we'll hopefully have release 2.2 out in the next week or so. That will be followed very, very shortly, probably by a release of Tazama 3.0. One of the key functionalities that we are working on at the moment is complete multi-tenancy, down from the user interface level to the data layer. So complete independent multi-tenant operation of the system. Particularly, that is also a requirement for Camisa, but we accelerated that a little bit to bring it forward because we realized that there are some other territories that are currently evaluating Tazama for particular multi-tenancy operations so that people can leverage shared infrastructure for better economies of scale.
Cool. I think Olu has two questions. What deployment model has worked best for Tazama adoption? Detect, block, and reject based on rules and patterns, or detect, flag, but process and flag for post-investigation?
That's a difficult question because we know the one that we would prefer, right? We would like to say that you should be evaluating the transaction, you let the system do the blocking because that's the only way to do it quickly. We do find that in some territories, the regulators have identified high risk behaviors, such as, for example, the payment of a first time creditor. And in those instances, the regulators have actually recommended that those payments should be slowed down to the point where somebody can have a cooling off period and then they can properly consider whether they had intended to make that payment. And it might have been the subject of a scam. So in a regulatory environment where a cooling off period like that is enforced, it does give you a little bit of extra time to split your traffic to say, I want these high risk behaviors to be investigated first so that I can then make a decent assessment because those are delayed anyway. And these sort of run of the mill kind of payments, we want the system to take action. And then we are going to keep on keeping tabs on the system to make sure that the system is behaving accurately. And over time, that level of accuracy in the system will also be such that you can rely on the system to take those actions for you on your behalf. So in some environments, I think if you have a early sort of implementation of the system and the system is still learning about transaction patterns and behavior in your environment, you may want to delay the blocking so that you can get the investigations out of the way first and make sure that your investigation or your detection accuracy is at a higher level. We typically call that the burn-in period. And then if you have sufficient confidence in the system's ability to be automated, then you can let the system do the blocks right up front. So both of those are are available, but it would really depend on your risk appetite and your preference for the implementation.
Okay. Final question here, still from Olu. With confirmation of pay capability, how can Tazama prevent or has Tazama prevented account takeovers to initiate payments?
We do have at the moment a number of our rules that are focused on identifying transaction patterns that indicates account takeover. But where confirmation of pay is really useful is you actually have more information available about the creditor up front when you do the evaluation. So when you are doing the sort of the early steps in a quote or a transfer, sometimes all we know about the creditor is an alias. That is typically not enough information for us to make an assessment about the creditor's identity. But with confirmation of payee, we assume that more information about the creditor is available, which will give you the ability to better identify whether that creditor is a creditor that was already identified on the network as a scammer somewhere else, and then be able to use that information to add more, a richer risk evaluation to the transaction itself.
All right. Thanks, Justice. Do you have any last comments to wrap up?
No, nothing from me, but again, it's been great being able to present to the Mojaloop community, and all the best of luck. If you are implementing Mojaloop, please remember us as your fraud solution to follow.